what is the central thesis or theme of collective genius?
Well, what we wanted to study was the link between leadership and innovation because there's not much research on that connection. And what we found, and the central theme, is that if you want to build an organization that can innovate time and again, the conventional notion of what we think great leadership is about does not work. So it is not about being a visionary and communicating and inspiring people to fulfill a vision. Instead, it's about creating the kind of culture and capabilities necessary for people to be willing to do the hard work of innovative problem solving.
So really getting into the nitty-gritty, not the high, lofty.
Well, it's not so much just the high lofty. One of the things that a number of the different leaders we studied told us was that by definition, if you're trying to do something that's breakthrough, you don't really have a vision. Because you don't have the answer. You don't necessarily know how you're going to get the answer. So this idea that it's about being the person who knows the answer, knows the vision of where we're going, not quite right. What we did see is that these leaders did understand about purpose. What's the meaning of the work? Why are we together? What are we trying to get done that makes it worthwhile for us to be willing and able to do innovative problem solving?
So what exactly is collective genius? What is that, and how do we cultivate it?
Well, you know what? It's difficult to describe in some ways, which is crazy because we named the book Collective Genius. And it really comes from the idea that when we looked at leaders who built organizations that could innovate time and again, one of the things they believed is that, if you will, ordinary people could do extraordinary things. And as one leader said to us, everybody has a slice of genius. And your role as the leader is to figure out how to unleash that slice of genius in every person that works in your organization and use it and harness it for the collective good to get something done that's useful. So an innovation is something that's both new or creative and also useful, can be used by the organization to get something done. And the challenge is, can you unleash and know and get that individual slice of genius, and then can you bring them together to be useful to solve a problem that the group wants to get solved? So it's it's a little bit of an elusive concept, but it is really this idea that the whole is more than the sum of the parts, and that each of us has something to offer. If I could add one point to that, I think one of the ideas that was really quite central to the book is that many people are creative and innovative. Often in many organizations we think, oh, those are the people over there that are the creatives or the innovators. In these organizations, they believe everybody has that capability to some degree, and or a whole lot of it. They believe that everybody has the capability to engage in the creative, innovative process. It's not like some subset of people get to do it or know how to do it. And so you as a leader, again, need to recognize that this individual in front of you can do something extraordinary if you as a leader can figure out how to unleash those talents and those passions.
So what makes a great leader?
So what makes a great leader, I think, is someone who does actually understand that the task is not about him or her coming up with this vision and getting people to fulfill it. There is a role for that kind of leadership. I want to be very clear, because when we're trying to change an organization, visionary leadership is exactly what you need. But if you actually are trying to build a capability in an organization where they can do it time and again, they can innovate time and again, then you have to help people do innovative work. And we have this myth in our heads often that innovation is the result of some solo genius having an aha moment, but that is not the way most innovation happens. Most innovation is really the result of a collaborative work amongst people who have very different perspectives or different expertise. And it's also the case that it's not usually aha or fully blown. It's much more discovery-driven learning. We kind of act and stumble our way along to an innovation. And finally, most innovations are really not completely new. They're the combination of old ideas being used in new ways, or some old ideas reconfigured. And so unless you have a culture and capabilities that allows you to do that kind of collaborative work, then you're not going to be able to do this time and again. You might maybe do it once because you have some genius who does work it out, but if you want, again, to be able to do it continuously, which is what's required in our economy today, then it's about really focusing on building those culture and capabilities.
How do you think that leaders should assess and address all of the disruptive technology in the business world today and competition?
Well, one piece of the puzzle is you are you do want to, as a leader, focus on sustained success. So having said that, you might actually need to be able to, quote, lead change, because we have to adapt and change, but then a lot of that change is not incremental, it's really breakthrough, and that leads you to have to think more about doing innovative work. And so I think one of the things that as a leader you need to think about is it's not going to be all about what you're capable of doing. I think most, even great visionary leaders know that. But they need to really focus again on how do we help people be willing and able to do this hard work. It's emotionally taxing, it's intellectually taxing. You know, there's not a lot of safety in organizations today. So you as a leader have to help people prepare themselves to deal with all the change that's all around them in a pretty insecure environment that we all live in. So I think to be a great leader and to really build an organization where you see that sustained success and you're going to be prepared and open to disruption, because none of us really want to be it's insecurity that comes with disruption. So you as a leader have to recognize both the emotional and the intellectual tasks associated with building a sustained business today, and I think help people address the head and the heart, and that, and maybe to some extent the soul, going back to the purpose of the work, and the work needs to be meaningful to people. So I think that one thing that you do to prepare them is you help them understand that you're in it, we're together on this, you're not alone. You know what? We're going to make some missteps and some mistakes, and you're not going to be punished, for those, because that's what happens when you're trying to adapt. We actually are doing it in a collective way where you have some right to have some influence and decisions. The hard work you do is going to be used. It's not me in the end who's only going to decide what happens. And so again, I think you were so kind to read the book, and one of the things we see is in these organizations is they have more inclusive ways that decision making gets done. So if I do all that hard work, it will be worth something. I'll be able to contribute. So I think one of the things is you do build a culture that helps people be open to the fact that, yes, we're going to feel insecure. Yes, there's going to be this anxiety. Yes, there are going to be these disruptions, but I'm not in on it. I'm not in on this alone. I have a company that I feel a part of a community that can help me get this done. And also, I know that we have some of those capabilities necessary. The other thing, though, is I actually wrote another book at the same time with a co-author as I was working on this book called Being the Boss. And the reason we wrote that book, I just want to be real clear, is because of the question you're asking about disruption. Because what we saw, for instance, is if you really want to prepare an organization to deal with disruption, you also want to encourage people to be very curious, be very outward looking and paying attention and scanning their environment and sensing what's going on out there, so that you're not, as the leader, having to tell them, by the way, look at this disruption that's coming. They're actually coming to you because you've helped them learn how to have that outward focus, how to build networks that are very outward looking so that they are bringing in information to the organization about what's coming. So I think, again, that's the other piece of the puzzle. And then the being the boss piece and the leadership part of it, we talked about 3 imperatives. One is managing your network. And that network piece, one part of it is your network broad enough and diverse enough for you to be bringing in information to the organization so that you can help the organization stay open and have, anticipate what's coming so you can kind of prepare yourself. So I think that's the other piece of that puzzle. Having everyone in the organization understand that their role is to look out and identify, as it relates to their area of responsibility, what's happening out there that we need to be aware of.
What are some of the paradoxes of innovation, and how should we deal with them?
Oh, there are a number of them. One of the most, in some ways, the best way to describe one of the paradoxes is really the individual versus the collective, right? So I have an idea, new maybe, but is that idea useful? So the first paradox is really that you do have to unleash all these diverse slices of genius, but we all know that you can unleash diverse slices of genius and diverse ideas and have chaos and conflict, and it doesn't turn into anything useful. So one of the companies I had the privilege of studying and my co-author came from was Pixar. So they talk about the importance of, for instance, what we ended up talking about is creative abrasion, which is a concept you do see in the innovation research. Basically, the idea is that you never really get innovative ideas unless you unleash them and then you abrade them against each other. So you actually have to have that diversity and the conflict to refine those ideas to create a robust marketplace of ideas. So the first paradox is about how do you get that marketplace of ideas? How do you get the individual and the collective going? So you, on the one hand, have to be supportive enough to have enough psychological safety so that people will share those ideas, but then you need to confront and abrade those ideas so that they get refined enough to have this robust marketplace of ideas. So there's a competition for the ideas, because competition is good. The second set of paradoxes really relate to this discovery-driven part of the collaborative process, that in fact we can't plan our way to an innovation, but we can kind of act our way or organize our way to it. So those two paradoxes really have to do with how do we do the kind of learning and flexible and improvise enough to do the experiments necessary to learn as fast as we can to the innovation, because since we can't just plan it out. So the second set of paradoxes really have to do with, on the one hand, you want to experiment and learn. On the other hand, you got to produce, you got to perform in the end. And so, for instance, at Pixar again, everything is considered to be open, and everything can change until the movie actually wraps. So there is a lot of learning and development and improvisation, not a whole lot of there's structure, but pretty iterative process. But at some point, the director, they need to finish the movie, and it needs to be there, right? So there's the deadline. So that's between that learning and experimenting and finally producing something on time that's ready to go. And that requires structure and metrics and all of that. And the last set of paradoxes really have to do with the decision making. So on the one hand, most innovation is more bottom up. We know that from a lot of research. It's not top down. We also know that it takes some patience for people to really be able to combine ideas and do that kind of integrative decision making I was talking about earlier. On the other hand, there's urgency. You got to finally get it done. Again, as you know, one of the examples at Google, finally the website's getting a little wobbly and YouTube has to be up is one of the things we looked at. So at some point, you have very top down where the head of the group says, this is it. This is as good as it's going to get. We can't perfect this because now, the website is in danger, so we got to make a decision. So the last set of paradoxes really have to do with that tension between letting things be bottom up, being patient enough to let people work through ideas, and finally saying, time to decide. Got to get moving. And that often requires very top-down activity, particularly in organizations that tend to have very very bold kind of ambition and really want to do things with excellence, which is quite important. But on the other hand, you got to be pragmatic about it, and it's got to get done.
Delicate balance.
It is, yes. It's finally like an editor saying to you, the book has to come in now. And draft 55, not happening. You're on 54, and that, you got to give it a rest. Otherwise, you'd keep playing at it.
How can leaders support the willingness to innovate?
So the willingness goes back to this issue of how emotionally taxing and intellectually taxing it is to truly do breakthrough work. And for that, really, it relates to the kind of culture you build in the organization. That's what we found. And so we ended up describing that what we saw in these organizations where you saw a lot of innovation was a community culture. That is, you felt a part of a community. You felt, therefore, because you cared about the community, you wanted the community to fulfill its purpose, going back to why are we together and what's that purpose. And you also thought that the community would take care of you because you could kind of trust that people saw you as a part of that world. So we saw that it really was your culture that helped people be willing. And we saw that there were a set of common values in these organizations. They obviously all had very different cultures. But still, we saw at the heart, for instance, they had bold ambition. Their appetite was much bigger than their current capabilities. People felt a deep sense of responsibility. People actually valued collaboration and learning. And that obviously was supportive of the whole process of what it takes for innovation. Then we saw that there were what we called rules of engagement or norms for how we're supposed to work together and for how we're supposed to think about problems. So as an example of a norm, is in these organizations, you were supposed to make sure that the minority voice got heard. Didn't mean that that person necessarily had influence or that group, or you did what they wanted, but they were heard. In terms of thinking, for instance, there were some other norms that we saw too, but in terms of how we're supposed to think, one of the things you were supposed to think whenever you're looking at a problem was you're supposed to have a holistic view of the problem. If you're only looking at a piece of it and not seeing it as in the whole, then you were corrected for that, or people would point that out. You were also allowed to question any assumption. Nothing was considered sacred, and that again allowed for, if you're going to have a disruption, sometimes what happens, disruptions, we turn away from them, but in these cultures you're allowed to say, anything's possible. It's not the craziest idea in the world, let's look at it seriously. And so there were these rules or these norms that were developed in these organizations that supported those values, that made people feel like, I'm willing to do this hard work, and it's going to be okay. I'm going to be taken care of, and I have a contribution to make. So that was what the willingness really came from the culture. And as again, we use the word community culture because that sort of captured the feel or the essence of what we were seeing.
pursuant to that, how can leaders actually help create the ability to innovate?
So the ability was really about three capabilities that we saw in these organizations: creative abrasion, creative agility, and creative resolution. So creative abrasion was about how do you create this marketplace of ideas through conflict and debate. Well, diversity and conflict is probably the better way to put it. And there, what was really interesting is in these organizations, they amplify differences as opposed to minimize them. So even though they kind of help people learn how to do active listening and to inquire, which are all these very important things, they also taught people how to really advocate for their point of view, because they wanted that competition of ideas. And the second capability was creative agility, and that was really about discovery-driven learning. So, for instance, design thinking. This idea that we see many more organizations trying to learn how to do design thinking, where you actually do know how to design sort of more rigorous experiments, if you will. Not too rigorous, but rigorous enough to get the answers to what you want, and you learn along the way. And so in these organizations, they knew how to do that experimentation. And then the final one, again, is they had decision-making approaches that were very clear. It wasn't that everybody had the right to say what we're going to, in the end, do. But the way the decision-making was done, it was more inclusive and more patient in a way, so that more ideas could be combined together. So we were very influenced by very consistent with what Roger Martin found in his work on opposable thinking and opposable ideas, is people were able to combine things that didn't look like they'd necessarily go together because they took the time to do that. They didn't let one group win. The boss couldn't simply just say, this is the decision, or whoever the expert was not the only one who'd weigh in and say, this is where we're going. In fact, experts are one of the bigger problems in innovation, because
Really?
yeah, because if you're an expert, you actually in some ways are very invested in the status quo, right? You're perhaps most challenged by the disruption. So we found that, that was an interesting piece of the puzzle for us. And when you think about it, so for instance, we were told a story about apparently Steve Jobs, this is reported to me, he went to meet with Edwin Land, who was the founder of Polaroid, which obviously was one of the most innovative organizations for years in this country. And he asked, apparently, Edwin Land, what do I need to think about when I'm building my companies? And he said, you know what, let me just tell you a story. Whenever the scientists and the technologists are stuck and not being, quote, very creative and innovative, I bring in students from the humanities, from other local colleges, just to spend time and ask the naive question of the scientists and technologists and kind of help them break through their thinking, because they don't know that that's a, quote, a stupid question or a naive question. So they kind of forced, either in explaining to these humanities majors or, listening to their questions, sparked, again, the diversity and the abrasion, sparked a different kind of thinking about a problem.
What is an innovation ecosystem?
Oh, gosh.
And how does one build that?
Yes. Well, this is something that this is what I'm working on right now with my colleagues. And at the end of the book, we ended up talking about two different topics that we thought there's lots more to learn about. One is how do you build these ecosystems, and the other is how do you develop leaders who can do this stuff. So an ecosystem really reflects the fact that many of my colleagues have been studying the new alliances or different kinds of alliances we're seeing that companies are having to make because they don't have the expertise inside themselves to do that next thing they know they need to do. So what we begin to look at, for instance, and what you see is even, in some ways, competitors coming together in joint ventures to create that thing so that they're not cannibalized because somebody else is going to do it to them. I mean, we see lots of these joint ventures like between EMC and Cisco and VMware. They all came together to create a whole other business, that VCE, that frankly was going to eat in all of their businesses because they knew it was going to happen. It's about the cloud. So we got to do things differently. So what we wanted to do was to begin to study these ecosystems. And so we ended up looking at San Diego. And what San Diego has been a place that many people feel is there's been a lot of innovation there, particularly around biotechnology. And I think nanotechnology as well. But what we looked at is sort of the hub of that is the university. The University of California, San Diego plays an important role in doing some basic research that is then used by a number of the private sector, the companies in the area, to get certain things done in different kinds of partnerships. So you're seeing both private partnerships, public-private partnerships. We're now studying 3 governments. that are trying to build ecosystems in certain areas that they think are very important to their economies. Again, where it's not just about one company or one organization, it may be even across sectors having to come together to solve. One example is to look at the brain and understand the brain, just like what happened with DNA and the sequencing of DNA. There's been a challenge put together, we have Alzheimer's, we have lots of things going on to bring together government, private sector, universities to try to crack what's going on with the brain and how the brain works. It's a big collaboration. Needless to say, not one party can do it. There are also these ecosystems being built around different cancers. So one university, one scientist is not going to be able to get that done. Can't we build a more active community of cancer researchers who are looking at breast cancer, for instance, but not just the biologists, but also bring in the nanotechnologists because of personalized medicine, bring in the people, the computer scientists. So you need to bring in, again, diverse expertise to address a problem that we obviously hope they solve quickly. But I think how you lead those, we just began to explore that a little bit. We have a lot more learning, and other people are studying this question too. They're not looking so much at the leadership. Again, leadership is kind of being left out a bit, but they're looking more at the structures and the governance, how you govern these things, and we're trying to look at what are these individuals like that actually can put this stuff together. And we're just now beginning to collect information on that. And we collected some, but it was in the epilogue part of the book when you feel like we're just starting out and exploring, but now we're really looking at it in some depth.
So in the context of this with collective genius, how can leaders make sure that they build a learning organization?
Which is quite fundamental, I think, to being that is a piece of being able to innovate. Because if you can't learn collectively, so it's very different for us individually to learn than for us collectively to learn. And I think one of the things that Peter Senge and others have done a lot of research on, how do you build these learning organizations, and to some extent our own work I think is an extension of some of what other people have found. And so I think, again, what they see is a certain kind of culture and an approach to thinking about problem solving that allows you to be open to and learn together. But I have to say, one of the challenges, and I don't know that I have all the answers to this, of course I know that I don't have all the answers to this, I have lots of learning to do myself, is people may know how to coach an individual and help that person learn, but how you coach teams is a different task. And I think one of the things I've been working a lot with in the executive program I've been working in is how do you coach teams of people, teams of executives, particularly ones who might be very, they're competing, right? Often because they're in senior teams themselves, but they need to collaborate enough to get constructive work done in a real way. And I think so how you actually engage as a leader with people around you, even with your own senior team, because if your senior team doesn't know how to learn together and role model that for the rest of the organization, you shouldn't be so surprised that the rest of the organization doesn't really believe that you're serious about being a learning organization and how to do that. So I think that's one puzzle. The other thing that makes it hard is, and I'm sure given what you do, you hear this all the time, executives feel extremely pressured to meet the quarter, right? Expectations. And that short-term orientation is not at all consistent with building a learning organization or building an innovative organization. So it takes a fair amount of courage as a leader these days to make the investment necessary to truly deliver on the promise of what you can get if you have this more agile learning kind of organization, or which is really at the heart of an innovative organization as well.